What's all this then? Huh? All right, settle down now. Quiet, quiet. Out there. All right, let's take a seat. Mind the fire there. All right, quiet down. So, y'all want to hear the story, do you? All right then. But remember, you asked for it. The small town of Low Point, squatting in a patch of mud that could have once been called a fertile valley, shivered and creaked in a constant icy breeze. It seemed nearly forgotten by the rest of the world, felt trapped between the long shadow of the mountain and the dark, stoic branches of Black Bend Forest. Its inhabitants were dirty and cold and half-starved most of the year. These hardships, which made existence close to unbearable, also made the people bitter and cruel. They suffered no fool, nor sluggard, nor rabble-rouser. Every day was filled with work. Work meant survival. Life was hard enough without the useless, the idle, the crippled. Life was hard enough without the Timberman. The real trouble began many years before, as all trouble begins. Wolves came in the night and took the slowest sheep, the laziest pig. They knew then and they know now as well as anyone. Once you feed a wolf, it keeps coming back. What started as once or twice, through the years became 6, 8, a dozen times. Some said you could almost set the moon by it. A strange turn of phrase, but the townsfolk understood it. You may ask, why not just leave? Pack up and build another town in a better, safer place. You might expect to hear the same tired excuses. This is our home. Our blood is in this ground. We won't be intimidated by it. We won't allow ourselves to be defeated by nature. But they all know none of these easy answers are the truth. They all know there is no safer place for them. They know their fight is not against nature. Sometimes a wolf is not a wolf. You may also ask, who fed that first wolf and why? Every one of those townsfolk would lie and say it had been an accident. If only we had paid more attention that day. The boy had just run off. We couldn't control him, not a one of us, though it weren't for a lack of trying. But that wasn't how it happened. That's why, no matter how far they might move to, it'll never be a safer place. Lies always come back to bite you. That boy, in a way, was the source of the trouble, though it wasn't his fault by any means. He was truly innocent, as all infants tend to be, but it seems these days that perception, or opinion, more often than not, wins over truth. The townsfolk point of view, although quite wrong indeed, was arrived at in a logical manner, superstitiously speaking. Even before his birth, the boy was a difficult child. From the very beginning, he was stubborn and indecisive. Stubborn in that he stayed in his mother's belly a good 2 weeks longer than he was supposed to. And indecisive in that he just couldn't make up his mind about how best to finally enter the world. Should he come out head first or feet first? Or maybe he'd crawl out by his little fingers. After 3 days of him tossing and turning inside, the midwife, taking it upon herself to decide for him, reached right in and yanked him out by whatever part she could grab hold of first, which ended up being his left arm. 2 things were observed immediately. One other sometime later. The first was that in all his moving, he had gotten his cord in a whole bundle of knots. This was taken as a bad omen. The second was that the boy was more than a little blue in the face. This, however, was quickly and adeptly remedied by the midwife, who got him crying soon enough. The boy cried, and he cried for another 3 days straight. That was not so much because he was angry to suddenly be out in the cold air, for it would be discovered he took to the crisp winter air quite well. The boy cried rather because the third thing that had been observed some moments too late was that his mother had promptly given up living simply from exhaustion, and he sensed it. It was thought sure as anything that he knew he would lose his own mother once he was born, which is why he had so adamantly refused to separate himself from her. This was taken as another bad omen. Whether out of grief or anger, or a combination of the two, the boy's father immediately and wholeheartedly rejected him and went about the rest of his life alone, caring only for himself, leaving the midwife and a few other women taking turns looking after the infant. Nothing more was said on the matter, because if a father doesn't want his own child, that child would be much better off with someone else. At least, that would be the case with any other child. Nobody in town really thought it fitting to give him a name on account of the bad omens, and no real family to speak of. So he was always just called the boy. As the months went by, the boy grew fast. He grew big and strong, ate everything put in front of him, and everything else he could reach. A healthy appetite, to put it mildly. But the townsfolk began to notice some peculiar things about the boy. He looked kind of funny. His skull was thick, making his head seem too big for the rest of him. His eyes were too far apart. Nose was a bit flat and turned up. His jaw stuck out. His left arm hung kind of limp at times, like it wasn't quite setting right. And he was always drooling and panting, as if his tongue was too big for his mouth. He looked kind of funny. Then there was his behavior. He took to crawling and then walking fine enough, but he never spoke a word, just grunting and pointing and fussing whenever he wanted anything. didn't look anyone in the eyes, but kept to staring at the ground as if he were following ants or spiders that were never really there. Despite the perpetual cold air, he refused to keep his clothes on. Nearly caused a scandal the first few times he got loose outside. But after several months turned into a couple years, they just grew accustomed to it, though they never fully approved of it. "Can't do nothing with a savage like that, boy," they'd mutter to themselves. No matter how hard anyone tried to teach the boy anything, he just couldn't learn. Farming and shepherding and blacksmithing was well beyond the boy. In fact, the closest he got to any of them was near to a sheepdog, except he did a much better job scattering than herding in. More of a menace most times, a nuisance, or at the very least, a waste of space, according to the majority of folks. In any case, the boy became quite fond of the sheepdogs in town, and they seemed to like him well enough. One might say he did learn to talk after all, just to the dogs. He got the growling down really good, and even picked up a few barks well enough it was nearly impossible to tell the boy apart from the dogs when you weren't looking. A few folks figured if that boy was going to act like a dog, he might as well be treated like one. So they took to feeding him only on scraps tossed onto the floor. These few folks who came up with the idea eventually became just about all the folks. They were cruel, you know. Not to worry. Long ways from here. A few more years went by, and the boy just kept eating and growing and showing no signs of ever being useful. One particularly harsh winter, when the food was getting low and rationing was getting more strict by the day, people started going hunger mad, which got them seeing the boy a little differently. They looked at an extra mouth to feed, attached to a body that never once contributed to any work the entire time he'd been alive. A body that was thick and young and dumb as an animal. The midwife that had been taking care of the boy all those years, despite her own starvation, managed to recognize the hunger madness in folks' eyes, and took it upon herself to do the only thing she thought was the most sensible at the time, the lesser of evils. She would save the town from its own desperation, from its unusual cruelty. She gathered the other women that helped out with the boy, who, all luckily, still had some sanity left, and had them draw straws. The midwife, though, unfairly held tight to the short straw, so there would be no mistaking who was to complete the task. That night, when the sky was at its darkest, she grabbed a lantern, roused the boy, and with a heavy heart and an anxious mind, took him by the hand and led him outside, out to the forest. A few dozen paces in, there was a slow, peaceful stream that the boy had played in many times in the 9 years of his tragic existence. Although it was freezing, the water distracted him easily enough, and the nurturing woman convincing herself she was doing the merciful thing, set the lantern on a nearby rock and slowly, quietly backed away until she was far enough to turn around and run back home, heart pounding at the thought of what she'd done. Of course, nobody saw what happened, but they didn't have to. On such a still, quiet night that it was, noises from the woods had no trouble making themselves heard. That night, as most were kept awake from empty bellies, they heard the forest get its fill. They heard the growling, and the snarling, and the fighting, and the snapping, and the long, long silence. Upon sunrise, having gotten no sleep, the townsfolk arose and began their day of chores and survival, and with the boy nowhere to be seen, their hunger madness likewise disappeared. That's how it happened. That's how the trouble really began. Get out of here! Anyway, the very next season was the best it had been in a long while. The crops were tall, and the livestock gave birth at an alarming rate. It seemed that some curse had been lifted from the town. That useless, bad omen of a boy was out of their lives for good, and all the better their lives were for it. Or so they thought. Not a month into summer, those wild noises in the forest got hungry, and they got bold. They would come in the night, when the air was still and the town exhausted and passed out from a hard day's work. The next morning, something would be missing, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. They just sort of sensed an absence. As I said, it started with a lamb, or a pig, or a goat here and there, but it didn't stay that way. After 2 years of only the occasional theft, the wolves made it a regular occurrence. All the town's animals started disappearing faster than they could count. The folks grew mighty concerned and decided to implement a nightly watch, just like this one here we're on now. They took turns, 3 men at a time, spread out across the field on the woodsy side. It worked for a good long while, keeping the wolves well away, cautious of peeking their heads out of the forest. It worked so well, in fact, that eventually they started thinking their problem was over, and the watching slacked off. Of course, the wolves were far more intelligent than the people gave them credit for. As soon as they spied an opportunity, they struck again. They got 2 goats in one night, heads chewed off and laying on the ground. The rest of them carried away to be eaten in the sanctuary of Black Bend. From then on, they doubled up the watch and doled out a fierce punishment to any man caught nodding off during his turn. Unfortunately, this did not remedy the situation. Those wolves learned a few things, like going around the long way to come up behind the watchfires. By the time any of the men knew what was happening, it was too late for the poor animals. Now understand that these men were fine shots, every one of them, and they got themselves a gray hide or two, but that didn't help matters one bit. No, those wolves, those night demons terrorizing the town, just kept on coming, more often and more aggressive than ever. Their monthly attacks gradually turned into weekly ones. And they kept learning too. They got to be quick as lightning, but quiet as mice. The kills were over and done before the goat or lamb had a chance to cry out. And the poor sheepdogs proved to be terribly unreliable. Some nights they bark at every shadow that turned out to be nothing, and others they slept soundly without so much as a "what was that?" The folks grew mighty frustrated and had no choice but to resort to shutting up all the livestock in every barn and shed and living room, even in the middle of summer. You might think that that would hinder any wolf from reaching its intended victim, but as you probably have guessed, you'd be dead wrong. Near as anyone could figure, those wolves became like phantoms, taking what they wanted without a trace of a hole in the wall or a broken latch. It was downright unnatural. Finally, when one of the milk cows was found dragged into the woods, half eaten with its ribs bare and empty and its head nowhere in sight, the townsfolk got angry and they got organized and built themselves an extra tall fence, thick as that tree stump and long enough to go all the way around the whole town till both ends met together. Of course, if a barn wouldn't protect the livestock, a fence wouldn't do a better job, no matter how tall, not against such devilish hounds. But that didn't stop them from building it. It took half a summer and several acres of forest before they were satisfied. They felled so many trees and pushed back the edge of the woods a fair distance from the town. That quiet little stream was fully exposed to the wind and the dim light of autumn, and the wolves' territory was now significantly diminished. You could imagine those wild, bloodthirsty creatures responded to this encroachment not with their usual violent thievery, but with a message. It was a particularly foggy morning. The air was thick, and it stuck to the clothes and the skin till folks felt nearly soaked. A horse was found dangling from the top of that tall fence. Its neck, snapped and torn open, was hooked on, leaving the head flopping on the outside and the body hanging stiff on the inside. The blood dripped long and slow to the ground, stained black on the fresh wood. Its underside was torn open down the middle, with all its innards spilled out, but left untouched. Not a bit of that horse had been eaten. Not a one of the townsfolk could guess how a pack of wolves could manage such a precise thing, and on such a tall fence. The message seemed clear enough. Nothing and no one would ever be safe in the town of Low Point, not as long as the wolves were allowed to remain. A meeting was called to vote on who would be the unlucky brave souls to venture out deep into the forest. 10 men with 10 rifles went tiptoeing out real quietly through the tangle of black roots. The town waited and watched the woods and listened for the men and for the wolves. Hours of silence went by, and then, far in the distance, they heard it. 10 shots rang out. 10 screams echoed off the mountain. And when the echoes had faded away, a chorus of 10 victorious howls came spilling into the valley. There was no mistaking after that. It was all well beyond the natural, and the town was cursed, had been ever since that boy. 10 weeks went by without incident, which was no coincidence. The town had a bit of a reprieve, though it didn't help matters. The night watches were going strong as ever, double and triple guard shifts. Campfires burned every dozen paces. Rifles were put in the hands of every resident big enough to hold one. They wouldn't dare risk letting their guard down again. Chores were neglected. Folks were deprived of sleep. Their nerves were in tatters. They started shooting at every shadow in daylight and at every rustling noise in the dark. Wasted more bullets than they cared to admit. When the wolves struck again, the whole pack came creeping out of the forest, barking and growling, dashing from here to there, dodging rifle shots. The guards couldn't hit their mark worth a darn. Can't fight off wolves while fighting off sleep and the shakes that come with fear. Those wolves were taunting the whole town that night and kept at it for over an hour. Without any warning, the commotion stopped, and they all dashed back into the woods like children suddenly bored of playing a game. Everyone was quite relieved and thought they had successfully held off the pack from getting past the fence. They went on thinking that until the sunrise revealed a bloody white nightgown hanging on the branch of a tree. They had gotten in sure as anything and snatched a little girl right from her bed. All that hoopla had merely been a distraction. Once it was discovered, a couple witnesses spoke up, swearing they saw the biggest of the wolves running upright on its back legs and its front ones swinging by its side, long and thick with the muscles of human arms, mutated just right for carrying off young children. Most folks dismissed it at first, attributing it to hallucinations from so many nights without sleep. "Your mind's playing tricks on you," they said. But they stuck to their word. Wouldn't be convinced otherwise. It was a wolf, straightened up, 7 foot tall or more. Every time they repeated it, they remembered another detail. Deep-set, solid black eyes, long, skinny fingers instead of paws, a mouth that opened twice as wide as normal, and with 2 sets of teeth. Despite its unnatural description, the more they told it, the easier it was for the whole town to believe in it. After all, their troubles in all those years went against natural law. All the native tribes have this ancient belief that if a man were to eat the heart of an animal, a bear or a lion, he would essentially absorb the attributes of that animal. Its strength, speed, courage, viciousness. The whole town started pondering this and remembering that night and what had happened when that boy run off. Folks wondered that if such a thing was possible, that a man could become like an animal, just maybe an animal could likewise change into a man. That theory was accepted soon enough, and considering the circumstances, folks thought it right to give it a name, so they set to calling it Timberman. Life for folks in the town of Low Point had been mighty hard enough all those many years ago without such troubles. But they let their cold, cruel, stubborn hearts rule over them, and a handful of wrong choices had led them into a predicament they could not overcome nor escape. Oh, but some folks tried. The man whose girl had first been taken, he still had a wife and 2 other daughters left alive, and he had had enough of this devilry. He packed up his family and left to find a new home, start a new life, free from the pain and the fear and the sleepless nights. They left, everyone watched them go, and no one saw them ever come back. But 2 days later, the man's head was found stuck on top of the fence. The rest of the town didn't dare think that his girls got away unharmed. Yeah, the Timberman had most assuredly taken over. And so it went on, random nights throughout each passing month. Sometimes an animal, sometimes a child, sometimes an old woman. The more it happened, the more folks claimed they caught glimpses of the Timberman among the trees, between the houses. Just about everyone went back to life as usual, but now in full acceptance of this new regular aspect of their hard life. Many took up to praying, though to whom or what no one could say, just that they sincerely pleaded to this entity, this wolf god. Please not tonight, but if tonight, not me nor mine. A hard, troublesome existence. Wake early, do the chores, live another day, pray, survive the night. Over and over as a regular thing, a normal routine. Wake, chores, live, pray, survive. Please not tonight, but if tonight, not me nor mine. And if me or mine, not tonight, another time. Eventually, all that praying grew into a sort of religion, and folks knew that a religion had to have rituals and such, and so another town meeting was held. There was not as much heated discussion as there was an eerie, knowing silence, for they all knew well the reason for the meeting. An unspoken decision was to be reached, and they went about deciding without so much as one word uttered between them. The townsfolk just stood there, gazing around at each other, studying every face studying them in return. The silent question evident in everyone's eyes. Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? This deciding went on for as long as they felt necessary, until all that looking narrowed down to one face, and all those cruel eyes agreed, it's you. That face belonged to a grown woman, never married, a midwife, you might say. Though she couldn't freely admit she was willing, she was at least resolved to abide by the decision, because there was no denying what she saw in all their faces. It's definitely you. Thus it was that on the very next evening, they guided that woman out to the thick, tall fence towards the haunting, stoic branches of Black Bend Forest, and tied her wrists up on a sturdy post. Left her there all night, not a one of them brave enough to watch, but at the same time too curious and hopeful to shut their ears. Maybe some folks lasted the night, and maybe some couldn't help drifting off to sleep at one time or another. But whatever the case, no wolves, no timberman, no crying midwife was heard. Sunrise came. Folks peeked their head out the fence, and there she was, tied up, sleeping, and untouched. A few thought that perhaps leaving her there all day might be a bit unwarranted, and maybe they ought to bring her back inside. But as they spent time pondering, caution or dread kept them from doing anything, and by the time they realized they spent nearly the whole day thinking, it just seemed a waste cutting her down, as soon enough they would just be tying her back up again. Up she stayed, drifting between sleeping, shivering, and weeping gently. One bad decision often leads to a lot more bad decisions, and finally, nearly 10 years after their first, the remaining folk of Low Point would soon suffer the consequences of their last. This time, the moon was full and bright, so if anyone had a mind to look, they'd see plenty if anything took place. This time, it was fortunate that no one had a mind to look. No one saw the silhouette of the timberman creeping out of the woods. No one saw that hellhound monster lead its pack of wolves towards the tall, sturdy fence. No one saw anything that night. They kept their eyes shut tight and kept their lips muttering a prayer to a wolf god to spare them, not me nor mine, when all the while it was their own sins that conjured up the very beast that rained terror upon them. All their praying did nothing to drown out the sounds that filled the air. Sounds of dozens of massive paws splashing through the mud, claws scraping and scratching wood, the snarls and screeches mixing together, the ripping of clothes, the cracks and pops of bone, the thuds and slaps of flesh getting flung to the bloody wet ground, and on it went, while they just kept repeating on and on. Not me nor mine, not me nor mine, not me nor mine, not me nor mine, not me nor mine. The noise ended. The prayers continued on till daybreak. When they could no longer keep their eyes closed, there was no mistaking who was and wasn't there. Everyone that had survived the night burst out of their houses to find the pieces. All the grown men, dragged from their beds, torn apart at every joint, lay scattered across the whole town. The woman, no longer tied to the fence, lay curled up in the mud, sleeping and untouched. You see, everyone knows wolves prefer to hunt their food. They don't like being fed. The folks' little religion died with all their men that day, and they were, forevermore, trapped in a small, creaky town at the bottom of a cursed valley, knowing they couldn't leave, not knowing how long they would survive if they stayed. They had no choice but to remain at the mercy of this savage army of beasts, led by an unforgiving god they summoned them to themselves from out of the forest's deepest, darkest parts. What once was a town just looking to survive had gradually become a pile of rotting splinters under the almighty swing of the Timberman. Of course, you might think that what happened to Low Point was so strange or impossible. Wolves getting past fences and into homes, a mutated creature stealing folks right out of their beds. There's nothing else to call it but supernatural. But for wild things in forests, the hunt had always been natural. The truth is, that night, when that midwife left that boy in the forest, he didn't get eaten by the wolves. Although the boy never learned anything of real value by the town folks' standards, he learned enough for his own. He had learned how to communicate with the canine species. He had learned to survive, fully exposed to the cold, harsh world. He had learned the feeling of neglect, rejection, and abandonment. With the wolves, he would come to learn acceptance and the love of brothers. He would come to learn how to hunt rabbit and deer and sheep. Through the years living with wolves, the boy grew to be a big, strong man. His naked body covered in curls of thick hair for a winter coat. His far-apart eyes were alert and keen and good for seeing nearly all the way around him. His flat, upturned nose was always open wide, good for smelling the tiniest things floating on the breeze. With an iron nail he dug out of a barn door, looking at his reflection in that calm, quiet stream, he filed his teeth down to a row of fangs. During one particularly numbing frozen winter, he gnawed off all 10 fingertips down to the first knuckle and scraped the exposed bone back and forth on a rock till they were sharp as claws. Eventually, the day came when he was to rise to his final place among his brothers, be fully initiated into the pack. He challenged old Papa Wolf, as was only natural. They wrestled in a fierce battle, Papa Wolf scratching and chomping down every chance he could. The grown boy, with those strong, sharp fingers of his, grabbed hold and just kept pulling and pulling and pulling until old Papa's jaw separated from the rest of his head. With one last pitiful whimper, old Papa Wolf relinquished his position, lay down, and let his life slowly drool out of him. When the boy recovered from the fight, he skinned old Papa, and while his brothers filled their bellies, he went over and put his back to a tree, and he rubbed up and down, scratching and scraping till his skin was shredded and falling off, Then he lifted old Papa's hide and wore it on his back like a fine winter coat, with a top jaw hanging over his forehead. It took the rest of winter and all of spring for his skin to heal, fusing that hide on to become part of his own body. From then on, his wolf brothers were bound to him, to follow in whatever carnage and mayhem he so desired. That's the Timberman, what brought terror and death to the cruel, unfeeling residents of Low Point. Unusual, strange, yes, but supernatural? Is it so mysterious how monsters are born into this world? Or who they choose to hunt? Cruelty breeds the cruel things that lurk in the shadows and wait for you under your bed. It's the cruel folk that... Hey! I told you to get! Go on now! Yeah.